Welcome to the Midnight Crown and the Christmas Veil audiobook. Hello, listener. Thank you for being here. You are about to embark on a magical journey filled with ancient secrets, forgotten songs, and a delicate balance between worlds. This story is brought to you by Saber Kuba, the storyteller behind this mesmerizing journey. If you enjoy this audiobook, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Your support helps more listeners join this adventure. Share your thoughts, questions, or suggestions. I'd love to hear from you. Now relax, press play, and let the magic begin. Let's uncover the mystery together. Prologue. The whisper of snow and stars. The winter breeze was a silent presence, a cold murmur that swept through the mountains and whispered ancient tales among the pines. Snow fell with a solemn calmness, like time itself had stopped to listen. Each flake was a perfect, shimmering tear of ice, catching the light of the distant stars and the pale glow of the moon. It was a night that felt both ordinary and extraordinary, a moment where the veil between reality and magic felt thin. The sound came again, faint but persistent, a whisper, like the wind itself was trying to communicate. It was old, forgotten, buried beneath centuries of snow and silence, yet it lingered in the air like a faint echo of some ancient prophecy. It spoke of a time when the veil between worlds would tear, a moment when the stars would align and a key would awaken. Something powerful, something ancient, something bound to the frost and the night sky. The whisper was not a language anyone could understand, but its meaning was felt nonetheless. Come if you dare. The words stirred in the wind, a promise and a challenge. A prophecy had awoken. A thread had come undone. And somewhere in the cold darkness, a journey had begun. The snow swirled. The trees sighed with the wind, and the mountains watched in silence. The whisper lingered, as if the stars themselves were listening. It was an invitation, or perhaps a summons to those brave enough to answer. It was the beginning of a story, a tale as old as the snow, as old as the mountains themselves. And yet, no one could hear it but the one whose heart had been chosen. Chapter 1: The Frosted Throne. The throne of crystal sat in the mountain clearing like a relic from a forgotten age, a guardian of secrets and ancient promises. It rose from the snow like a monument, shimmering in the moonlight with blue and silver hues. Its form was elegant, otherworldly. A throne not made for kings or mortal power, but for something older, something hidden, something eternal. It was a throne of ice and glass, with jagged spires that reached toward the heavens, as if daring the stars themselves to come closer. The air around it felt colder, sharper, as if the snow and wind knew better than to disturb it. It had sat there for centuries, untouched, forgotten, its purpose buried under snow and the weight of time. The snow crested in perfect arcs at its base, untouched by footprints, undisturbed by the wind. There was no sign of life, only the glint of moonlight reflecting from its icy surface. Yet there was a feeling, a presence perhaps, that lingered in the air. It was a pull, subtle and sharp, like a melody on the edge of comprehension. He stood at the edge of the clearing, his breath coming quickly as if some unseen force had drawn him there. His coat was soaked with snow, his breath visible in the cold air. His heart pounded, uncertain if it was fear or excitement that drove him. He could feel it. The throne had been waiting. It was not the first time he had heard whispers, not the first time he had felt the pull of something ancient, buried in the snow and shadow. His feet sank into the snow as he hesitated, his hands trembling slightly, as if resisting an unspoken command. The wind danced through the trees. The air was sharp and cold, and yet he stepped closer. There was no sound save the wind and his breathing. His fingers hovered just above the icy throne. It was beautiful and terrifying, its presence a riddle he could not solve. His voice felt fragile, but he managed to speak as though testing the air itself. "What is this place?" he asked, though he knew the snow would not answer. The throne glimmered as if it understood, though there was no voice, no clear sound in response. His hand trembled again. The whisper returned, carried on the wind this time, low and clear. "Prove yourself." The words froze in his chest. His fingers clenched into a fist. His body felt small against the great, ancient presence of the crystal throne. His thoughts swam with the weight of its pull, its ancient promise, its history buried deep within the snow and starlight. His breathing came faster. He could turn back. He could return to the warmth of the distant fires, to the safety of the paths already known. But the whisper lingered, clawed at him, and his hand fell onto the icy surface before he could resist. The cold was sharp. His body tensed as he felt the icy touch bite into his skin. The moment he made contact, the snow shifted. The air roared around him. The wind screamed like 1,000 voices in the trees. His heart leapt into his throat as if the throne itself were alive, pulling him into its cold embrace. It was a mistake, or perhaps it was fate. His vision blurred, and before he could step back, the throne shimmered, its glow expanding like an ancient star about to explode. The veil trembled, the wind howled, and reality shifted. He tried to pull away, but the power had already gripped him. The snow danced around him like a living thing, and he could feel himself slipping, pulled into a veil of mist and ancient promises. It was only the beginning. Chapter 2. A crown made of midnight. The world was not as he had left it. He opened his eyes, or perhaps they were opened for him, to a sky darker than he could comprehend, a deep velvet blue streaked with streaks of silver. Stars glimmered like sharp diamonds scattered across the expanse, but they felt unfamiliar, alien, as if they no longer belonged to his world. The air was colder here, sharper, and the wind did not have the same familiar scent of snow and pine. This was different. This was somewhere else. He was lying in snow, but not the snow of his world. It was deeper, ancient, and pulsing with energy, alive in a way that made his skin tingle. He could feel its touch on his hands, its sharp bite at his fingertips. It was beautiful yet wrong, as if it carried 1,000 stories, 1,000 secrets that whispered just beyond his comprehension. He rose slowly, his hands trembling as if the air itself would shatter at his touch. His breath came in quick, shallow gasps, as though the very act of breathing felt strange here. His gaze was drawn to the horizon, a strange shimmer of light and shadow that seemed both familiar and yet impossible. And then he saw it, the outline of a crown, or at least what he thought might be a crown. It was not a crown of gold, nor silver, nor anything he could name. Its edges shimmered like shards of midnight, fragments of a dream made solid, and its glow was faint but unmistakable. It was the kind of object one would imagine appearing in forgotten stories, in the tales of ancient kings and queens, forged from starlight and shadow and power. It hovered in the distance, barely visible, but he could feel it, the pull of it, the weight of its presence, as if it had been watching him all along. He shivered. His hands gripped his coat, his body aching with exhaustion, confusion, and cold. He tried to make sense of this, but his mind felt as fractured as the snow underfoot. The wind whispered again, and it sounded like words this time. Ancient words, words in a language long forgotten. The crown calls you. The words came as though from all directions, from every snowflake, from the air itself. They sent a shiver through his bones. His body felt heavy, and yet he could not resist the pull, could not resist the feeling of purpose that came with it. There was a part of him buried in his soul that recognized this pull, even if he could not articulate why. He stumbled toward it, his feet sinking into the snow, his hands outstretched, the air colder with each step. The snow here felt different, a crystalline kind of cold, like ice made of stars. It was almost alive, shifting as though it could see him, as though it had intentions, thoughts, memories. The crown waited. It was not seated on a throne, nor was it locked away. It hovered there, waiting for him, a question, a mystery, a promise. His thoughts were chaotic. What was this place? What was this crown? What was he meant to do? Before he could think, he was there. His hand stretched toward the glow, and as he touched it, his entire body was consumed by sensation. It was as though he were plunged into a river of ice, a current of shadow and stars that pulled him, tugged at his very essence. He gasped, his breath lost in the cold, and felt his body tremble under the weight of its presence. The moment felt eternal, a heartbeat stretched into infinity. He saw visions in flashes, shadows, ancient rituals, figures in cloaks, a throne in the snow, whispers in the wind, the crown, and then himself. 1,000 images. 1,000 pieces of something ancient and unknowable. The crown recognized him. His knees fell into the snow as the sensation passed. His body felt fragile, broken, yet alive, as if something in him had been woken, had been set into motion by this simple touch. The whisper came again. "You are the chosen. The crown will guide you." The words were cold, but they made sense in a way he could not articulate. He could not escape this. He could feel it pulling at him, anchoring itself into his bones. His fingers trembled as he clutched the cold fragments of midnight. His mind was racing, every thought fragmented, but all led to the same conclusion. He had become a part of this world now. This was not just some journey, some passing snowstorm. This was a choice, or perhaps it was never a choice at all. The crown, ancient and beautiful, had selected him, and there was no going back. He looked up again at the sky, at the stars, at the horizon that seemed to stretch into infinity. The crown glimmered faintly in his hands, a beacon in the cold, promising answers and more questions. It was only the beginning. Chapter 3. The Song of the Solstice Keeper. The wind rose in a symphony, carrying with it ancient sounds that seemed to linger on the edges of comprehension. It was a melody, faint at first, like a whisper through the trees, but as it grew, it became clearer, more defined, an ethereal hum, like the voice of the stars themselves. The sound swept through the snow-covered expanse, so delicate yet powerful it felt as though it could cut through stone and ice. He closed his eyes as the wind tugged at his hair, the melody seeping into his bones like an ancient memory. It was beautiful, otherworldly, like a song that belonged neither to the earth nor the sky, but to something older, buried beneath the snow and stars. He could not explain why he felt as though the song were speaking to him. His chest ached, his heart strained to listen, to understand. His fingers tightened on the cold, midnight crown in his hand as though it might hold the answer. He could feel the pull again, something, a thread, a connection between the melody and the crown, the snow and the ancient power. "The keeper," he heard in his mind, though no words were spoken aloud. It was faint, layered under the wind, layered in the very essence of the melody. The song was unlike any he had ever heard. It was not simply a series of notes, nor a tune, nor a familiar rhythm. It was more like a language, ancient and timeless, one that could not be spoken but felt. His body vibrated with it. His muscles tensed with every note. His thoughts fell away like snow before a gust of wind. The keeper. Who was the keeper? He had no answer, only questions. His mind felt heavy, as if the song were trying to show him something, to teach him, but he could not grasp it. He stood there, his breath ragged, the snow still swirling around him as though the wind itself were alive. It was then that he saw a figure, a silhouette in the misty fog of snow and darkness. It emerged slowly, ethereal yet solid, its form defined by the moonlight and the shimmer of icy mist. A figure dressed in dark robes, their features obscured by shadows and hoods. The figure was moving toward him, moving with the grace of the wind itself, every step deliberate, every motion ancient and calculated. He stumbled back, his breath catching in his throat. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice thin and fragile against the melody. The figure came closer, its presence commanding but serene. The song grew louder, almost overwhelming, but somehow he felt it did not harm him. It was guiding him, beckoning him closer. The figure stopped just a few feet away, the wind whipping through its robes, and lifted its head. Though the features remained hidden, he could sense the figure's gaze, piercing through the mist, piercing through him. "I am the solstice keeper," the figure said, and its voice was soft yet ancient, layered with centuries of ice and starlight. "I am the guardian of the balance, the keeper of secrets, the bearer of truth." The words came without urgency, without fear, and yet they felt like the weight of the world. He could feel their truth without fully understanding them. "The crown chose you," the keeper continued. "The stars have spoken, the winds have carried their message. You are here because you must be. The path will test you, the veil will challenge you, but you are strong enough to endure." He tried to respond, but his voice caught again. His hand clutched at the crown tighter. His mind swam. "What is this crown?" he managed to ask, his voice barely audible over the wind and the song. The keeper lifted its hand, and for a moment, he thought he would see its face, but all that was visible was shadow and light. The wind picked up again, dancing through the robes, and the keeper's voice came with even greater authority. "This is the crown of midnight," it said. "Forged in darkness, made of starlight and shadow, buried in time until now. It is a key, a beacon and a burden. It holds both power and a curse. Only one who is ready may wield it." He closed his eyes as the words sank into him. A key, a beacon, and a burden. His chest ached. His thoughts felt scattered, uncertain. What did this mean? How had he found himself in the midst of ancient prophecy, ancient power, and ancient songs? What had he stumbled into? The keeper's voice rose again, harmonizing with the melody. "You must learn the song. You must listen. The solstice keeper holds the wisdom of balance, of light and dark, of the veil between worlds. You will need the song to find the path. It will lead you through shadow, through veil, through peril, and through truth." He tried to process the words, but they felt both clear and inscrutable, as though layered with meaning he could not yet uncover. His chest ached, his breaths came heavier. The melody tugged at him like a physical thing, pulling at his very soul. "What must I do?" he asked, his voice shaking. The keeper raised its hand again, the wind carrying the motion like a wave of sound through the snow. "Follow the song," the keeper said simply. "The solstice keeper always listens, and you will learn to listen too. Trust the crown, trust the veil, trust the stars. The song will guide you to the answers." And just like that, the figure began to retreat, disappearing into the swirling mist of snow and shadow, its robes fluttering like wisps of smoke. The wind rose again, carrying the sound of the melody, and it felt as though the keeper had never truly been there, except that he could still feel its presence. A whisper, a shadow, a promise. He shivered, his hand tightening on the crown as though it might protect him from the cold and the weight of the ancient melody. His heart was still pounding, but it had quieted a little. His mind was racing. What did it mean to learn the song? What would he face? The snow shimmered around him, the stars danced overhead, and the wind pulled at his hair and his coat. The journey had only just begun. Chapter 4. The veil between worlds. The horizon felt like an endless line of shadow and light, a delicate fracture in reality itself. He stood alone in the snow, the wind howling around him, carrying with it the ethereal notes of the keeper's song and the pull of the midnight crown. His thoughts felt heavy, but something in his chest, something ancient, urged him to move forward, even without knowing the path. The snow beneath his boots was colder now, sharper, and every step felt like pushing through an unseen barrier. It felt as though the air itself were resisting him, as though reality itself were pulling tight against his presence. The veil, he thought, must be near. The keeper's words lingered in his mind. Trust the veil. But what did that mean? What was the veil? His breaths came quick and shallow as he trudged through snow that felt both alive and still, as though it could recognize him and his intentions. He closed his eyes and tried to listen again to the melody, but it was fainter now. The wind had taken it, scattered it into pieces, and he struggled to grasp it again. He could feel its presence, soft and distant, yet alive, but the veil had grown closer, and its presence felt both natural and menacing. When he opened his eyes, he could see it. A shimmer in the distance, a ghostly outline of light and shadow. It appeared as though the snow itself had split, a translucent, shifting wall of light. It felt unreal, a mirage or a memory brought to life. The veil between worlds. It was beautiful, its edges moving in slow waves like liquid frost. It glimmered in shades of pale blue and white, and yet it felt so thin, so fragile, that he was almost certain it would collapse at the first touch. His fingers were still wrapped tightly around the midnight crown. He could feel it vibrate faintly as though resonating with the veil. The air grew colder as he approached the veil. His body trembled, and he could feel his own breath escaping him in small, visible puffs. The wind had died down, and the silence felt louder here, dense, a kind of quiet that was not empty but alive. He could sense the other side, though he could not see it. Perhaps it was his imagination, but it felt as though the veil pulsed, as though it breathed. This was the passageway, the gateway, the thin line between two realities. He took a deep breath and took his first step toward the veil. His heart clenched in his chest. The air felt like ice as he moved, and his limbs shook beneath the weight of fear and uncertainty. His fingers brushed the cold, icy mist that hung just beyond the veil's edge. It felt soft, like the exhalation of wind or smoke, but colder. So much colder. His hand trembled as it moved through the veil. It felt like dipping into water, like reaching through a fragile curtain. He expected resistance, but there was none. His body passed through and the world shifted. The sensation was disorienting. He felt as though he were being pulled, stretched, reshaped by unseen forces. His body felt weightless, his breath caught, his vision blurred. For a moment he thought he was no longer in his body at all, but then the sensation passed. He could feel the snow beneath his feet again, and his breath came in sharp gasps. His eyes widened. He was somewhere else. The snow here was different, the air colder, the stars brighter, but they felt distant and fractured, as if this was not quite his own sky. The veil shimmered behind him, thin and fragile like a curtain of mist, and he could feel its presence still, its whisper of magic and memory. It was vast here. The landscape stretched endlessly, white and blue and silvery mist. The sky was a tumultuous mixture of stars and shifting light, as if time itself were confused here, not knowing whether to move forward or backward. The wind was still, the snow untouched. His footsteps felt louder here, more real, as though they mattered more. He could sense the shift, the presence of a power just beyond his sight. His fingers tightened on the crown and he understood. This was the veil, a fragile space where worlds met, where reality and shadow danced. It was cold here, unnervingly so, and yet the veil had promised him answers. His path would lead him deeper into this strange space. He heard a sound, a whisper perhaps, or the creak of snow. His breath quickened. He looked around, his eyes searching the horizon, but there was nothing. The veil shimmered faintly behind him. Ahead, there was only snow and mist. A voice tugged at the back of his mind, a whisper, layered with power. Trust the veil. He could not see it, but his heart knew that the veil held truths, secrets, pathways through time and ancient promise. His hand clutched the crown tighter. His steps felt hesitant, uncertain, but something within him told him that the journey had only just begun. He took another step. The air felt like an electric current now, sharp and alive. His senses were heightened, his breath ragged, but he could feel it. The pull, the presence of power, the weight of the crown and the veil itself. He would follow it. He would trust the keeper's words. The veil would lead him to answers or to doom, could be one or the other or both. He pressed forward. The snow glimmered faintly, mist rising from the horizon, and somewhere ahead, the veil shimmered, fragile and beautiful, like an ancient promise. His heart beat faster, the crown pulsing with every beat. The journey was not over. It was only beginning. Chapter 5. The King's Oath and the Winter's Curse. The snow grew heavier as he moved through the veil, a curtain of mist and cold that refused to let the stars or horizon stay constant. His breath came in gasps, his legs aching, the pull of the crown an ever-present weight in his hand. The wind had returned, but it was gentler here, whispering as though it held secrets it was eager to share. The veil felt alive around him, alive and watching, a presence both ancient and unknowable. He could feel the weight of history here, 1,000 lives, 1,000 whispered promises, and beneath it all, the haunting tug of his own uncertainty. The veil was no longer merely a passageway. It was alive, a living thing, holding memories, truths, and curses. And then he saw the monument, barely visible in the snow, a silhouette against the mist. It was ancient, older than he could comprehend. A great throne stood there, carved from ice and crystal, its outline gleaming faintly beneath the stars. It was massive, regal, and intimidating. The throne was more than a seat. It was a symbol, an artifact, a relic, and yet there was something about its presence that felt off, as though the earth itself rejected its existence. He approached it with careful steps, his heart pounding. The air grew colder as he drew nearer, his breaths now visible as icy mist. His hand trembled as he gripped the crown tighter. Something about this place felt both sacred and cursed, a place of promises and broken oaths. The sound came again, an ancient whisper, layered with sorrow. The oath binds all. The curse cannot be broken without sacrifice. He froze, his breath caught in his chest. The words came from nowhere and everywhere, wrapped in the wind, drifting toward him like the very snow itself. His gaze was fixed on the throne, its icy crystals glimmering faintly as though alive. His instincts screamed at him to retreat, but his legs would not move. His fingers tightened on the crown. What oath? What curse? The wind roared as if mocking him. He dropped to his knees beside the great throne, the snow sinking beneath him, his breath coming fast. His fingers shook as they touched the icy stone. It was cold, colder than anything he had ever felt, and yet it was alive with power. He could feel the history of it, the weight of promises made long ago, binding, unyielding. The air shifted again, and before him the figure appeared. It came from the snow and mist, the veil itself giving it shape. It was a king, or perhaps what was left of a king, his figure obscured by ancient robes, his eyes burning like twin stars of blue light. His presence was commanding, and yet sorrowful, a heavy reminder of time's passage and broken promises. The figure raised one hand, and the air shimmered with power. "I swore the oath," the figure said, its voice low, guttural, like the sound of ice cracking. "I swore to protect this crown, to protect this throne, and to protect the balance. But in doing so, I bound myself to the curse." His words hung in the air, cold and unyielding. "A curse?" he managed to ask, his voice trembling. "What kind of curse?" The king's gaze met his, piercing through him. His voice was a whisper, but it felt like the weight of centuries. "A curse of endless winter," he said. "It is a binding, a punishment, a consequence of power. The crown grants dominion, but with dominion comes sacrifice. Each generation must swear to uphold the balance, to protect the power, or else they risk losing everything. And so I swore, but in doing so, I condemned myself." He could hear the pain in the voice, the deep, unyielding sorrow of a ruler forced into an impossible choice. "I passed my power to my heirs, but my family failed. The curse grew. The veil grew thin, and the balance began to shatter. And now you have come," the figure continued, his voice growing louder with each word. "You are the one chosen by the stars, the one tied to the crown. You must decide. Will you honor the oath, or will you break the curse?" The weight of his words fell on him like an avalanche. His hands clenched the crown tighter, his body trembling. His mind was a storm of possibilities, questions, fears. The king looked at him, the glow of his eyes brighter now. "You must decide," the king said. "The curse cannot live without sacrifice. Every step you take will lead you to this choice. Will you make your oath to the crown and accept its weight? Or will you shatter the veil and risk the unknown?" The words felt final, unyielding, and yet he could not see the answer. His mind was consumed by doubt, by the pull of his own fear. His body felt broken, his heart thudded painfully. The veil shimmered behind the king, faint shadows dancing along its misty edges. The crown glowed in his hand, alive and ancient. His breath came quicker, the wind pulling at his hair, at his clothes. He did not know the answer. Perhaps no one ever could. The king raised his hand one final time, and the air shimmered. The wind roared louder, the mist thickened. His voice rose again, colder, stronger. "The choice will be yours," he said. "But the crown will not wait forever." And then the figure was gone. The wind came rushing again, the mist swallowing everything. The sound of the throne, the words of the king, the pull of the crown, it all seemed to vanish into the cold. He was alone again, his knees in the snow, the wind tugging at his hair and coat. He could feel the weight of the words, the weight of the oath, the weight of the curse. His hand trembled as he gripped the midnight crown. His heart felt like a stone in his chest. What would he do? What could he do? The snow glimmered around him, and for a moment, the veil felt closer than ever. He had a choice, but the choice was not clear, and so he would take his first steps into the unknown. Chapter 6: Footsteps in the Frozen Woods. The veil lingered in his mind like a distant echo, its whispers full of power, curses, and ancient decisions. His breath felt sharp in his lungs as he rose from his knees, the snow cold against his fingers. The wind howled louder now, pulling at his cloak and hair. His steps were uncertain as he turned away from the ancient throne, away from the shimmering veil. It felt as though the mist itself were alive, watching, waiting, but he forced himself to keep moving. The frozen woods loomed ahead. They appeared out of the veil's mist, a dark, shifting forest of snow and ancient pines. The trees were massive, their branches heavy with snow, their forms looming like dark sentinels. The air felt colder here, sharper, and the sound of the wind seemed trapped between the branches, turning the woods into a whispering labyrinth. He moved cautiously through the snow, his breath shallow. Every step felt heavier, his pulse pounding in his chest. The crown remained in his hand, its presence a constant, steady hum. It felt alive, as though it recognized the dark paths he now tread. The woods were quiet, and yet not silent. There was a sound, faint but distinct, a whisper like footsteps. His hand instinctively tightened on the crown. His eyes darted around him, his body tense. He paused, trying to locate the sound, but the wind carried it, distorting it, sending it in unpredictable directions. Another sound, the soft creak of snow beneath the boot. It was close. His heart thudded as he took another step forward, uncertain, but compelled by something he could not explain. His breath came quicker. The trees closed in on him, the dark forms of the pines twisting as if they were alive, watching him, listening to his every breath. He heard it again. The sound was unmistakable this time, footsteps. Not his own. Not the wind or the snow, but deliberate, slow, steady. His mind raced, the shadows of the trees dancing in the mist. His hand clutched the crown tighter, his eyes scanning the frozen expanse. A presence was here. The footsteps came from behind him. His muscles tensed and he turned sharply, his breath misting in the cold air. He could see nothing at first, just snow and shadows. The woods were vast, and yet he felt the presence again. A pull, a gaze, something that was not the wind. His heart felt as though it would burst from his chest as he turned his head. And there, just beyond the trees, a figure emerged. A shadow. It was humanoid, tall, almost graceful, moving through the snow with a deliberate slowness. Its form was obscured by the snow, the mist, and the dark trees, but its presence was undeniable. His pulse quickened. His breath felt caught in his throat. He took a step back, unsure whether to flee or confront the figure. The figure moved again, emerging further from the trees. Its movements were fluid, unnatural, and the cold seemed to gather around it. His mind could not make sense of it. A man, a beast, or something else entirely. His hands trembled. The crown felt heavier, pulsing now with an unfamiliar rhythm. The figure's presence felt ancient, older than the trees, older than the snow. Before he could decide, the figure spoke. A voice, low, clear, yet piercing. "Do not be afraid," it said. He froze, uncertain. His voice felt lost, caught in the cold. His hand tightened on the crown, his throat dry. "Who are you?" he managed to ask, his voice breaking through the cold wind. The figure took another deliberate step closer, emerging into clearer view, and now he could see the outline of its face, though the details were obscured. Its hair was long, tangled with snow, and its eyes glimmered faintly under the pale moonlight. "A guardian," it said, its voice soft but certain. "You seek answers, and answers are dangerous." His heart pounded. He could feel its gaze on him, its words both a warning and an invitation. "Answers to what?" he asked, his voice shaking. "To the curse," the figure replied. "To the veil. To the midnight throne and the oath you carry." The words hit him like a strike of lightning. His hand clenched tighter on the crown. "I know your path," the figure continued. "I know your hesitation. The crown hums with power, ancient and unyielding. You have been pulled here by destiny, by fate, and yet you struggle. That is the nature of power, is it not? To be both a gift and a burden." The figure stepped closer again, its form becoming more distinct, the mist swirling around it. "You must decide," it said, and now its voice was lower, almost a whisper. "But know this. Every choice has consequences. The veil is thin here, and the curse is ancient. Walk carefully." And then, as though it were never there, the figure stepped back into the mist, its presence fading like a ghost. The footsteps ceased, the wind picked up again, and the forest was still. He was alone once more. His hand shook as he looked down at the crown, its presence overwhelming him. The words lingered in his mind. Every choice has consequences. What did it mean? What could he do? His heart felt torn, his steps uncertain. The snow felt deeper now, as though the woods were alive, watching, pulling him toward something he could not see. He took a deep breath, his body trembling. His mind felt stretched, heavy with secrets, whispers, and ancient truths. He could feel the pull of the veil, the pull of the throne, and the pull of the crown, but what would he choose? The wind roared again, and he began walking. One step at a time, uncertain whether the woods would lead him to salvation, ruin, or something else entirely. The footprints followed his every move, though he could not see them. His path had begun. Chapter 7. The Midnight Garden of Ice and Thorns. The snow was still falling, fine flakes dancing through the pale moonlight, shimmering like shards of broken stars. His breath felt sharp in his lungs as he trudged through the snow, his boots breaking through the icy crust with each step. His path led him deeper into the frozen woods, the towering pines groaning with the wind, their shadows stretching like the arms of ancient spirits reaching out from the darkness. There was something here, something ancient, something alive beneath the snow, waiting in the cold stillness. The wind carried with it the faintest scent of frost, of pine, of ancient secrets. His heart remained uncertain as he pressed forward, the crown pulsing faintly in his hand, a steady rhythm like the beat of his own heart. The weight of it was unyielding, a constant reminder of the choice he had yet to make. And then through the veil of mist and snow he saw it. It appeared suddenly, as though it had always been there, hidden in the shadows and mist until now. The garden revealed itself beneath the pale light of the moon, its presence haunting and beautiful. A frozen glade, a hidden sanctum of ice and beauty, buried beneath centuries of snow. The garden was not as one would expect. It was not simply frozen trees and snow-covered paths. The plants here were ancient, crystalline, their stems glinting with ice, their branches twisting and weaving into strange patterns. They were thorned, jagged, sharp, beautiful and cruel, their forms suspended in frost as though time itself had stopped. It was a garden of contradictions, delicate yet sharp, beautiful yet dangerous, peaceful yet suffocating with power. He hesitated at the garden's edge, his heart pounding. The air felt colder here, sharper, the scent of frost and magic so thick he could taste it on his tongue. The crown in his hand thrummed with power, and he could feel its pull, an almost imperceptible whisper urging him toward the garden's heart. He stepped into the garden, his footsteps sinking into snow that seemed to glow faintly beneath his weight. The wind tugged at his cloak, and the garden felt alive. Each step was accompanied by the sound of snow shifting, ice cracking, and the faintest whisper of ancient voices. The plants here were not merely plants. They had a presence, a will, and they seemed to watch him as he moved through the garden. Their thorny stems stretched toward him, their icy branches glinting like frozen diamonds. The crown pulsed again, louder this time, almost in response to the garden's presence. It felt alive. He could sense the magic, the ancient energy embedded in the frozen earth, and the crystalline trees. His steps became more hesitant as he pressed further into the glade, every breath feeling colder, heavier, as though the air itself were alive. The center of the garden loomed ahead, a crystalline structure, a throne-like formation made entirely of ice and thorny branches. It glimmered faintly, the moonlight reflecting off it like 1,000 points of light. It was both beautiful and foreboding, a seat of power carved from frost and sharp edges. His pulse quickened, his hand trembling as he held the crown closer. He could feel the pull of the garden, the pull of secrets, the pull of promises made long ago. The air shimmered as though in response to his presence, and suddenly, he knew that he was not alone. There was a sound, soft, faint, but unmistakable, a whisper of movement. He spun toward it, his heart leaping, but saw nothing. The wind picked up again, and the sound seemed to return to the mist, vanishing. And then it came again. The sound was closer now, unmistakable. A voice, soft, low, full of ancient whispers. He strained to hear it, the snow around him swirling, the wind tugging at his hair. His breath felt caught in his throat. "Do not come here," the voice whispered. It was ethereal, shifting, hard to pin down. His heart pounded, his hand trembling. "Who's there?" he managed to demand, his voice uncertain but resolute. The voice did not answer immediately. The snow shifted again, and suddenly, he saw a figure stepping from the mist, as though conjured by the garden itself. It was a woman. She appeared ethereal, ghost-like, her hair pale like the snow and her eyes glinting with a strange ancient light. She moved with a grace that felt unnatural, as though she were part of the garden, not merely a visitor. Her voice came again, clearer this time. "You must not enter," she said. "This is the Garden of Secrets, and every secret comes at a price." He froze, his hand tightening on the crown again. His body trembled as he tried to comprehend her presence. She was beautiful, her face pale and ageless, her presence a cold whisper in the mist. "Why?" he managed to ask. "Because this place holds the heart of the curse," she said, her voice soft and unyielding. "The ice holds ancient truths, ancient power, and ancient binding. The crown will lead you here, but it will demand your soul in return." Her words felt like a dagger to his chest, cutting through his uncertainty. His gaze was fixed on her, his breath shallow. "You must choose," she continued, her eyes piercing his own. "Will you let the veil consume you? Will you enter, unearth its secrets, and risk your very life? Or will you turn back?" His heart thundered in his chest. The crown in his hand pulsed again, insistent, alive. The garden shimmered around him, its icy thorns sharp, its beauty haunting. His body felt torn between the pull of discovery and the fear of ruin. The woman extended her hand, her voice low. "Choose wisely," she whispered. The garden seemed to close in on him, its secrets clawing at his mind, its whispers full of shadows. He felt the cold grip of fear and the temptation of knowledge. The crown pulsed, the garden shimmered, and his hand hovered over the crown. What would he do? The choice felt as ancient as time itself. Chapter 8, The Solitary Watcher. The choice lingered in the air, a breath held between worlds. The crown pulsed in his hand, its rhythm quickening, its presence both a temptation and a curse. His hand trembled, and his heart felt as if it would tear itself apart from the weight of decisions that pressed upon him. The woman in the mist remained still, her pale figure ghost-like beneath the moonlight, her eyes piercing, unwavering. The garden seemed to watch him. The icy branches swayed with the wind, their sharp forms like the jagged edges of fate. Waiting. He could feel it, the presence of unseen eyes. He forced himself to take a step back, his voice low but resolute. "What happens if I enter?" His words felt fragile, like breaking glass in the cold. The woman did not move. Her voice came again, slow and soft, like whispers in a dream. "You will learn the secrets, but they will consume you." The crown pulsed again. He could feel its pull, the way it resonated with his very bones, a reminder of the veil, the curse, and his uncertain fate. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to think, to push the fear and temptation away. His fingers clenched the cold metal, but then another sound broke through, a faint noise, a shuffle, distant yet deliberate. His breath caught. His eyes snapped open, and he turned toward the source. His heart raced again as the sound came from the edge of the mist, near the trees. Something or someone was watching him. He froze, his body rigid. His hand tightened on the crown as he scanned the snow-draped trees. The sound came again, louder this time. A footstep, heavy, deliberate, cold. He was not alone. The woman in the mist began to fade as though the wind itself was pulling her back into the veil. Her voice came one last time, as faint as the wind itself. "You are being watched. Do not let your fate guide you into ruin." Before he could ask another question, the mist thickened, swallowing her entirely. The cold wind howled through the garden, the sound of snow in the trees like whispers of distant ghosts. And then the presence came closer. His hand went to his side, pulling his cloak tighter around him. The sound came again, a slow, deliberate movement, footsteps in the snow. His breath came faster. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest. Every instinct in his body told him that he needed to move, to escape, but his body felt paralyzed, his mind caught in the web of choices. He turned toward the sound, his gaze sharp, piercing through the mist. The snow felt colder, as though it were alive, its presence a living thing. The wind carried another sound, a whisper, and he could see something faintly, just at the edge of the trees. A figure. The figure was shadowy at first, indistinct, but as it came closer, the outlines became clearer. a tall, slender form moving deliberately, its shape humanoid but unnatural, as though it were not entirely alive. His throat went dry. His muscles tensed, and his breath came in short, shallow bursts. It was there. A presence unmistakable. He gripped the crown tighter. His vision narrowed as the figure stepped into the pale moonlight. It was cloaked, its face obscured by a hood. Its movements were slow, deliberate, and yet there was no sound to them, as though it were born of shadow itself. He could hear his own heartbeat now, loud and steady in his ears. The wind roared through the trees, but this figure did not seem affected by the cold or the snow. It moved with perfect grace, and with each step, the mist seemed to bend toward it. The figure came closer, and he could feel its presence, the cold, unnatural pull of its gaze. His breath caught again. "Who are you?" he demanded. His voice stronger now, desperate. The figure stopped, its form half shadow, half light beneath the pale glow of the moon. Its voice came soft, low, an ancient sound that carried through the stillness of the woods. "I am the Watcher," it said. The words sent a shiver through his body. The crown in his hand pulsed again, as though in response to this presence. His hand trembled. "What do you watch?" he demanded, his voice trembling slightly but stronger now. His heart felt like it would leap from his chest. The figure remained still for a moment before it spoke again. "The veil. The crown. The breaking of the ancient oaths." He frowned, his voice uncertain. "What does that mean? What veil? What oaths?" The figure stepped closer, and the sound of its voice felt colder, sharper now. "You carry the burden of the crown," it said. "But you are not alone. There are watchers, guardians, ancient powers that will seek to stop you if you pursue this path. The veil is fragile here, and once broken, the worlds will collide. You must tread carefully." The wind tugged at his cloak, and the snow swirled around him, obscuring the figure for a moment. His heart felt as though it would tear itself apart. "I don't understand," he said. His voice was shaking, but his tone was insistent. "Why watch me? What do you want from me?" The figure remained still, its presence unervingly cold. Its voice came again, sharp and low. "I watch because I must," it said. "But the choice is yours. Will you defy the curse? Will you shatter the veil? Or will you turn back, leaving the ancient secrets buried in ice?" The words were enigmatic, as though they were woven with meaning, yet their intent remained buried beneath layers of ancient whispers and threats. The figure's gaze bore into him. His hand remained clenched tightly on the crown. He had choices. His heart felt heavy. His soul felt burdened. The wind roared louder. The snow danced more wildly, and the figure began to fade into the mist. His voice came again, sharp but faint. "Choose wisely," it said, and then it was gone. The mist closed in once more, and he was alone again in the stillness of the garden. His breath shallow, the crown pulsing in his hand. He could not shake the feeling that he was not alone, that the woods were alive, that eyes were watching him still. What would he do? Would he press on, uncover the secrets, break the veil, and face whatever consequences lay ahead? Or would he turn back, surrendering the crown, the veil, and his fate to the cold, ancient dark? The choice lingered unanswered. The snow continued to fall. Chapter 9: Blood and Starlight on the Frozen Throne. The snow fell harder now, a fierce, unyielding curtain of white that seemed to silence the entire world. The pale moonlight was dimmed by the swirling mist and snow, turning the woods into an endless, featureless plain of icy shadows and glinting frost. His breath came in sharp bursts, his body trembling as he stood at the center of the garden, the crown still clutched tightly in his hand. The stillness was suffocating. He could feel the weight of the secrets, the pull of the veil, and the promises buried in the ancient ice. His fingers gripped the cold metal of the crown tighter as he fought the voice in his mind, the whisper of temptation, the pull of dark promises. His heart felt like it would fail him, the burden of choice too much to bear. The words of the Watcher haunted him. Choose wisely. What did they mean? What did the veil signify, and what would be the cost of breaking it? His breath hitched as he turned his gaze toward the frozen throne. The crystalline seat at the heart of the garden, jagged and sharp, made entirely of frozen branches and ice. It gleamed beneath the pale moonlight, a throne that looked ancient, as though it had waited for millennia for a king, a queen, or a decision. He took a step toward it. The crown in his hand began to pull again, stronger this time. Its presence felt like a heartbeat, and every beat spoke of ancient oaths, promises, and sacrifices. His legs felt weak beneath him, but he could not stop himself as he took another step. His breath came faster, his hands trembling as if the very air had grown colder. He could feel the throne's pull, as though it were alive, as though it were beckoning him. His vision blurred with the snow and mist, but he pressed on. As he stood before the throne, he saw that the snow seemed to shimmer beneath its seat, a reflection of starlight, shadows, and ice. The air felt colder now, and his heartbeat seemed to echo in the silence. His hand moved instinctively toward the crown, but at the last moment, he hesitated. No, he clenched his hand tighter. His heart felt torn between the pull of power and the weight of fear. The throne, the veil, the garden, all seemed to vibrate with ancient promises, and he feared he would never be able to return from this place. He forced himself to lower his hand, but his body betrayed him. His heart leapt as if by some invisible thread, and his fingers trembled again. His breath came in short, shallow bursts. It was then that the snow shifted. A sound broke through the air, sharp and deliberate, a sound that did not belong. His heart leapt in his chest, his breath quickened. He spun on his heels, his cloak whipping in the wind as he looked toward the source of the sound. There was a figure standing at the edge of the throne, just within the pale moonlight. It was not the same figure as before, nor the woman from the mist. This presence was darker, more sinister. The figure was clad in black, its face obscured by a hood, and its form emanated coldness, as though it were born from shadow itself. It had come from the mist, stepping into the moonlight with deliberate intent. His breath caught, his legs felt weak. His eyes locked onto this figure, and he could feel its gaze, cold, unyielding, unfeeling, piercing into him. "Who are you?" he managed to demand, his voice cracking with fear. The figure did not speak immediately. It moved toward the throne, its presence an unyielding force of cold and darkness. His pulse roared in his ears. He could feel his body shaking, his fingers still clutching the crown. His mind was racing, panic clawing at him. Finally, the figure spoke, its voice low, sharp, and laden with power. "I am the keeper of the veil," it said. The words sent a shiver through him. The veil. The words of the watcher came back to him. The veil is fragile here, and once broken, the worlds will collide. The figure stepped closer, the snow falling around it like a ghostly veil. "You have come too far," it said, its voice cold and absolute. "The price must be paid." He stepped back instinctively, his body trembling. "What price?" he demanded, his voice shaking. The figure raised its hand, and the snow itself seemed to freeze, as though time had come to a standstill. His heart pounded, and he could feel the cold grip of power emanating from the figure as though it were born from the earth itself. "Blood," it said simply. His breath hitched, his eyes wide with fear. "Blood." The crown pulsed again, louder this time. The sound was sharp, final, and he could feel the pull of it. His hand trembled as he looked down at it, his mind spinning. He could feel his knees threatening to collapse beneath him. The figure took another step, and the snow shifted again. The air felt colder now, sharper, as though death itself were standing there, watching him. "You would seek the secrets," the figure continued. "But the cost of such knowledge is steep. Will you pay the price, or will you turn back and leave the veil untouched?" His mind felt as though it were splitting. His heart was pounding in his chest. He could feel his soul tugging in two directions, one toward the throne, toward the crown, toward the veil and its mysteries, and one toward the safety of retreat. "Blood." The word repeated itself in his mind. He took a deep breath, the cold air sharp in his chest. His vision swam, but he forced himself to steady his resolve. His voice came out, trembling but firm. "I will not give my blood," he said. The figure stopped, its presence looming, cold, unyielding. For a moment, silence hung in the air, broken only by the sound of wind and snow. Then slowly the figure lowered its hand. The snow shifted again, and the presence began to fade, retreating back into the mist. His breath came faster, his body trembling. He could still feel the weight of the throne, the weight of the veil, the weight of his choices. His hand was trembling as he tightened his grip on the crown, but the presence was gone. The garden felt quieter now, though no less foreboding. His mind was a swirl of thoughts, doubts, fears. The crown pulsed in his hand again, soft now, almost pleading. He closed his eyes. The choice remained. Would he press on, uncover the secrets, and risk the unknown? Or would he leave the veil untouched, returning to the warmth of safety? The snow continued to fall. The throne glimmered and the veil called, and he stood there at the crossroads of fate. Chapter 10. The Breaking of the Veil. The snow fell in thick, heavy flakes, swallowing the sound of the wind, the whisper of trees, and the uncertain beating of his heart. His breaths came fast, his body cold and trembling, the crown heavy in his hand. The words of the figure blood lingered in his mind, a constant reminder of power, choice, and the steep cost of secrets. He stood alone in the vast stillness of the garden, his fingers gripping the cold metal, his soul warring with itself. The mist swirled around him, thick and blinding. His thoughts were a tempest, every path an abyss. His heart told him that the veil had to be broken, but fear whispered that the consequences would consume him. His mind could see the throne, could see the icy gateway it seemed to represent. He could feel its ancient promise, its endless weight. His body was at the edge of action and inaction, trembling as if caught in the space between two realities. A choice. The air shimmered in front of him, a faint glint of starlight caught in the ice and snow. His gaze turned back toward the throne. Its crystalline seat gleamed beneath the pale light of the moon. It seemed almost alive, an ancient relic, an offering, or a curse. His feet moved forward, uncertain. His breath came harder. There was no turning back. The crown pulsed again, stronger now, its rhythm insistent, and for a moment, he imagined it as a beating heart. He could almost hear it whisper, pulling, urging, promising power and truth. His fingers tightened as he took another step. His voice trembled as he spoke aloud. What will happen if I break the veil? His words cut through the stillness, and they felt fragile, insignificant. The snow seemed to shift as if answering him, though no one stood there. His gaze fell on the glimmering ice of the throne. He took another step toward it, unable to resist the pull. His breaths came harder now, his chest aching, his body trembling from the cold and the weight of his decision. He placed his hand on the throne. The ice was cold, colder than the air, colder than death itself. His fingers sank into its frozen surface, the chill sharp, like shards of glass in his veins. His vision swam as he felt the pulse beneath his touch, ancient, slow, and alive. The crown vibrated in his hand, a dark resonance, and the air around him seemed to tear. The wind howled, the snow roared, and for one moment, he felt a sharp, otherworldly pull. His body was weightless, his vision blurred. The throne beneath his hand began to glow. A faint, icy light shifting, twisting. His breath caught in his throat. The veil, it was breaking. The sensation was overwhelming, like an explosion of cold and light, like a rupture in reality itself. He could hear whispers, echoes of voices, ancient and old, fragments of things from other worlds, other timelines, other places entirely. His hand trembled, his body was shaking, and his breath came faster. The air shimmered. A portal began to form. The glowing light spread outward from the throne, the air folding and shifting. The mist seemed to bleed into the light, and a low, unnatural sound rumbled beneath it. A moan, a whisper, ancient and incomprehensible. His hand trembled harder. His body felt as though it would tear itself apart. He could see it. The veil was open, a gateway, shimmering, glowing, filled with shifting shadows and the cold winds of another world, stretched before him. His heart pounded, and his knees felt as though they would collapse. His hand trembled as he struggled to maintain contact with the throne. "Stop!" he gasped, his voice breaking. His other hand pulled at his cloak, trying to stop the pull of the crown, trying to stop himself. The glowing light intensified. The crown pulsed again, the light coming from it now like a heartbeat, a steady rhythm of ancient promises and truths. His breath came too fast, his chest ached. His mind swam, and then a voice, a whisper sharp and low, breaking through the wind. "Do not cross it." The voice came from the shadows, and he felt his body tense. His vision swam, and the glowing portal trembled. His hand wavered on the throne. He could hear footsteps, the sound of heavy steps in the snow. The figure was back, stepping from the mist, its presence cold, its voice sharp, low and unmistakable. "Close it," it said simply. His hand trembled harder as the figure emerged from the mist, closer now, its presence unyielding and cold. His vision swam again. His heart felt like it was breaking under the pressure of choice. The veil had been torn. He could feel its energy, its cold pull, the dark secrets on the other side. But could he force himself to close it? Could he find the strength, the will, to tear himself away from the mysteries, from the crown, from the temptation of the other side? He took a deep breath, his voice shaking. "I will close it," he said. He pulled his hand back, his breath sharp and ragged, and he pushed his will into the throne. His muscles tensed, his entire body straining, fighting the pull of the veil and the crown. He could feel the energy, the light, the ice, the whispers. His vision blurred, but he forced himself to push harder, to act. The glowing light began to fade. The wind roared, the snow danced, and the veil began to shimmer and twist, folding, struggling against his pull. His hand came away from the throne, his breathing ragged, his body trembling. He felt the weight of his choice, the crushing, agonizing weight. The veil trembled again as if fighting, but his voice was firm as he shouted into the wind, his words filled with resolve. "I will not let it through." The snow howled louder. The veil shimmered, its light fading, the icy glow dimming beneath his will. He gritted his teeth, his body shaking as he struggled to maintain control. The whispers grew louder, but he silenced them. His will was stronger. The light dimmed entirely, the veil was closed, the wind calmed and the snow fell again, gentle, quiet. His body was exhausted. His breathing came in sharp, shallow bursts. The snow danced softly around him. The throne was still there, the crown in his hand, its pull weaker now though still persistent. The figure stood silently in the mist, observing him. He closed his eyes, his breaths ragged. The veil was closed, but the choices were not over. They never were. Chapter 11. The Last Song of the Solstice Keeper. The snow fell like ancient whispers, delicate and silent, a shroud of white covering the garden and the throne. The air was still and heavy, holding secrets, promises, and the lingering tension of the choice just made. His breath came in uneven waves, his body weak from the effort, his soul battered by the echoes of the veil and the power of the crown. His fingers remained tightly gripped on its cold, unyielding form. The presence of the figure lingered behind him, shadowy and quiet, and he dared not turn to look. His thoughts swam in confusion and regret. The veil had been closed, but at what cost? What mysteries remained untouched, locked forever behind its shimmering barrier? His mind felt too large for his skull, the weight of ancient secrets pressing on his very bones. He closed his eyes, trying to steady himself. The whisper of wind tugged at his cloak, carrying the smell of snow and pine. His chest rose and fell in a steady rhythm as he forced himself to focus, to regain his strength. And then a sound, a faint melody, a note, a whisper of sound so soft it could have come from the wind itself. It was distant at first, but it grew closer, and his heart caught in his throat. A song. He turned his head toward the sound, and in the distance, through the veil of snow and mist, he thought he could see movement. A figure. Perhaps it was the figure from before, or perhaps it was something else entirely. His hands trembled as he lifted his gaze toward the sound, and the notes became clearer. It was a voice, a haunting melody, both beautiful and sorrowful, weaving through the still air, cutting through his thoughts and the cold fog. The voice was light as breath, and yet it carried the weight of ancient power. The sound was a blend of human sorrow and celestial harmony, old as the stars themselves. The song of the solstice keeper, his mind whispered. The legend had spoken of it. The keeper, the guardian of balance, a voice that could stir the very threads of the veil. He had heard tales, half-truths, words whispered by elders and carried by the wind, but he had never imagined it would sound like this. His soul ached as he listened. His body felt drawn to the sound, compelled, even as doubt threatened to keep him rooted. His hand tightened around the crown. The melody sang through him, resonated in every bone, every breath. He had to see it to find its source. His feet moved before he could stop himself, trudging through the snow, the sound guiding him. He stepped through the mist and the sound grew louder. The snow swirled harder now, but through the haze he could make out a figure. A woman, her form radiant even through the icy veil. Her hair shimmered like spun silver, her cloak billowing behind her as though woven from snow and starlight. Her eyes glimmered with ancient power, her hands raised as though weaving the very melody itself. The solstice keeper. She stood at the heart of the garden, the pale moonlight illuminating her presence, and her voice resonated in the air like the gentle pull of tides on the horizon. He could see her lips move, her expression serene yet burdened, as though she were the keeper of truths both beautiful and terrible. The air felt alive around her, the snow dancing to her song, the mist parting as though in deference. "Who are you?" he managed to croak, his voice hoarse. His body felt frail, his soul caught between fear and awe. Her voice lifted in another note, unbroken, the melody pure and celestial. "I am the keeper," she said, her voice finally breaking through the song, soft yet clear. "The guardian of the veil of balance of the long night." Her voice resonated in him, weaving through his bones like threads of starlight. His heart ached. "You closed the veil," she continued, her voice steady. "But the choice was only the first step. The veil cannot be left untouched forever. The balance will need to be restored." He stared at her, confusion battling with his exhaustion. "Why?" he managed, his voice barely audible. His hand was still clenched on the crown, its cold presence a reminder of promises unfulfilled. The keeper's gaze was steady, piercing, her voice growing stronger with each word. "The veil is delicate, fragile. It is held together by faith, choice, and the songs of balance. Each action has consequences, and now you must decide what role you will play." Her voice was a symphony, her words heavy with weight. His mind struggled to grasp them. "You closed the veil," she continued. "But the crown tempts you, does it not? The darkness calls. But power has its price. The solstice keeper has always guided, always maintained balance. Now you must choose." Her words danced in the air. His chest was tight. His mind struggled to see the path before him. "And if I choose wrong?" he asked. Her gaze held steady, unyielding, her voice dropping slightly as the wind tugged at her cloak. "Then the veil will break again. Balance will collapse. The price will be paid in blood, in ruin." The melody continued, haunting, perfect, weaving its way into his bones. He could feel the power of it, the pull of her voice, of her truth, of her certainty. The wind swirled around them, and his heart felt heavier. "What must I do?" His voice cracked again. Her gaze was intense, searching, and her voice came at last, steady and resolute. "You must listen to the song," she said. "And you must decide whether you will listen to temptation, to the crown, or to the melody of the veil itself." The wind roared again, and her voice rose, lifting into the air, blending with her song. The melody was now a whisper, a low sound that danced with the snow and the moonlight. It tugged at his soul, and he could feel his knees shaking. The crown pulsed harder now, alive in his hand. He could feel its pull, stronger than before, but the melody was clearer. It cut through his thoughts, filled his soul with ancient power, with doubt, with possibility. The choice stretched before him. 1,000 possibilities, 1,000 paths. His heart was caught between the crown and the song. He took a deep breath. The song continued, and then he closed his eyes. He listened. The whispers became a symphony. His soul felt lighter and heavier all at once. His choice was no longer simple. The wind and snow swirled. The veil stretched thin beneath the pull of music, and his heart danced to the rhythm of fate. Would he listen? Or would he surrender? The song played on. Chapter 12. Dawn on the frosted horizon. The snow fell in waves, soft and endless, as though the sky itself were sighing. His breath came steady now, the song of the solstice keeper still weaving through his veins. The veil felt fragile, thin, shimmering beneath the pull of melody and choice. His body was no longer trembling, but his heart remained uncertain, suspended on the cusp of decision, of consequence. He could feel time pulling at him, an eternal moment, the stillness before dawn, the quiet of power held at bay. His hand was still clenching the crown, its cold weight a reminder of ancient promises, ancient curses, ancient truths. His body ached from the choice he had just made. The choice to listen, to resist, to remain standing here, caught between two paths. The solstice keeper's voice had faded into the wind, leaving only the song. It pulsed ethereal, its notes threading through the icy air. His eyes closed again as he tried to lose himself in it, to find some clarity, some understanding. The sound was endless, a river of emotion and history, weaving between worlds, touching memories long buried in the recesses of his soul. His breath came in a steady rhythm. He could see it now, the horizon. The pale edge of light began to break through the mist, casting shadows and glints of light onto the snow-covered garden. It was faint at first, a streak of rose and gold, like the first tender breath of dawn. His eyes opened, and he could see the soft glow seeping into the whiteness of the snow, the mist, the veil. The air was alive, full of promise and the slow, steady march of the turning seasons. The veil was still there, but it felt weaker, the pull less insistent. He could hear it beneath the snow, beneath the wind, a faint echo of the keeper's melody. His gaze turned toward the throne, still gleaming faintly under the light of the pale moon. It looked more fragile now, as though it were merely a remnant of an ancient promise, a relic that had been partially undone. The solstice keeper moved closer to him, her voice still soft, her figure shimmering beneath the moonlight. She was steady, resolute, but there was something in her gaze, a sadness, an understanding that made his chest tighten. "You listened," she said softly, "and that is enough." His breath felt shaky, his body felt hollow, the pull of the crown weaker but still there. His voice came out low, uncertain. "What comes now?" he asked. Her gaze was steady, searching, but it held no malice, only certainty. "Dawn," she said. "The balance will hold. The choice you made has set things right, though the price was not without cost. Dawn will come, the veil will mend itself, and the crown will lose its power if you let it." He closed his eyes again, his heart pounding. Dawn broke fully now, the light rushing over the snow and the mist, illuminating the throne and the ancient garden. It felt fragile, fleeting, as though all the choices had led him to this moment, to this fragile sunrise. His body felt both relief and exhaustion. The solstice keeper was gone now, fading into the mist, her song lingering as the first rays of light broke over the horizon. He could feel himself letting go. The crown. It was cold in his hand, but the pull was fading. His hand, weak and uncertain, moved to set it down, to leave it behind, but then he hesitated. The crown was powerful. It could be a weapon, a tool, a key to secrets. His fingers trembled again, but he let it go. The snow was soft beneath his fingers as he set it on the ground, leaving it behind. The pull felt lighter as he stepped back, and the dawn became full. The garden was alive now, full of color, light, and the slow breath of nature. His eyes looked toward the horizon, where the mist danced and the sun rose higher into the sky. The veil had been closed. The song had been heard. His choice had been made. He let the dawn wash over him. The cold seemed to lift as the light came, the snow sparkling, the mist lifting from the trees. He felt his breath slow, his heartbeat steady. There was peace here, fragile, uncertain, but real. The solstice keeper's words lingered in his mind. The balance will hold. He closed his eyes one last time, listening to the wind, the snow, and the faint whisper of secrets that remained buried beneath the horizon. His heart was lighter, though the memory of his choice would stay with him. A choice between power and peace, darkness and light, temptation and hope. The veil was breaking no longer. The horizon stretched before him, glowing golden, full of possibilities. The journey was over, or at least it was for now. Epilogue. The whisper of snow and stars. Reprise. The stars hung in the sky like ancient lanterns, distant and beautiful, watching over the garden. The snow had settled into a soft, unbroken white blanket, untouched by time or choice. The wind danced lightly through the trees, and the whisper of their breath seemed like the voice of secrets, murmurs of old magic, of forgotten paths, and of promises fulfilled. He could hear it, faint and steady, a whisper of snow, a whisper of stars. The veil was intact. The solstice keeper's song would live on in the wind, in the snow, in the trees. Its echoes would guide the world through darkness and light, through the endless breath of winter. And yet he knew that some mysteries could never truly be closed. that the crown would always linger at the edge of dreams and choices. The stars twinkled brighter, and he took a deep breath. The veil would always whisper, but he would listen differently now. The journey was complete. The secrets were his now. The snow fell, and the stars watched, their distant light eternal, as dawn's golden light swept across the frost-kissed horizon and the whisper of snow and stars faded into silence. The journey came to its final rest. The veil remained intact, the balance preserved, and the echoes of ancient songs danced on the wind. This was not the end, but the beginning of a new chapter. A quiet promise that all stories, mysteries, and choices would live on forever beneath the light of the stars. Thank you for joining this journey through the Midnight Crown and the Christmas Veil. A story of magic, fate, ancient curses, and choice. Written and narrated by Saber Kuba. May the whisper of snow and the light of stars guide you always. The journey lives on.